Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. We're back with some more vibes for all you. And what we want to do here is, I'm Mr. Giant. Keep forgetting my name. I'm Mr. Giant. What we're going to do here is we're going to continue in the series of Simón Bolívar. And this one is called Leavings and Returns. Extra credits is at it again. Check them out, I tell you. They have some good stuff. So, I ain't gonna talk too much. I ain't gonna keep you all too long. Let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer. Let's see what Simón Bolívar is up to now.
As the Jesus, Maria y San Jose pulled away from the shores of Venezuela, one man stood on deck, looking back. He was a grimmer man, a harder man than the youth full of verve who, a handful of years earlier, had stumbled onto the shores of London. His wealth was gone, his power was gone, but his dreams were yet his. He vowed to return to those shores, and then turned away. His defeat has given him a new vision, a new idea of what liberation must look like. He no longer thinks of Venezuela alone. He now thinks of all of Latin America. He realizes that no one nation is enough to fight off the might of Spain, even declining and corrupt as it is. Liberty would have to come to all nations or none. He has become pragmatic. If this was going to work, Latin America couldn't just be a loose federation as the fledgling United States had become after its revolution. They would need to be a strong, centralized power. They would need strong leadership, with an executive who could act swiftly and decisively to pull the people together and deflect any Spanish threat. But before he could act on any of this, he had to get himself back into the action. He was stuck in Curacao, a small island held by the British off the coast of Venezuela, and he was penniless. The Spanish had confiscated all of his property, his mines, his lands, his slaves, all gone. He had bought his way into this revolution. How was he to continue without those funds? He was able to...
That's really odd. I mean, he's fighting for the common man, yet had slaves. I wonder how he treated them. Quite puzzling, I may add. Let's keep going.
He had bought his way into this revolution. How was he to continue without those funds? He was able to borrow a small amount from a merchant, just enough to hire a boat and equip a small band of men to sail for New Granada, where he had heard the revolution was still alive. And the revolution he found there was indeed alive, but it was fractured. Different groups vying for power in different regions. The whole country splintered. He had work to do. He rapidly won the admiration of their nominal president, and he and his band were commissioned to fight in the New Granada Rebellion. The local commanders, however, were none too eager to see this foreign revolutionary, one who had just handed his former commander to the Spanish. They sent him off to garrison a small town, but this time he would do more than merely dream of glory. He wrote, spreading his ideas to the world. He socialized, gaining the support of the local elite, and he walked among the people, gaining the support of the poor, the indigent, the downtrodden. His small band of 70 quickly grew to 200. Then he saw an opportunity. A group of royalists had occupied a position on a nearby river, cutting off revolutionary forces. He wrote to command to ask permission to dislodge them. His request was denied. He went anyway. His men built small boats and they paddled up the river. He sent one man ahead to offer the enemy garrison commander, a garrison which numbered 500, by the way, an opportunity to surrender.
Oh, he's bold!
And turned this envoy away. Then Bolivar's men came around the bend and leapt out of their boats, guns blazing. The garrison scattered in terror, leaving behind a large cache of weapons and munitions. Bolivar turned to the people of the occupied town and exhorted them to join his cause, and again his ranks grew. Over the next 15 days, he waged a lightning campaign. The men were like phantoms. They moved faster than anybody expected, and they always approached from ways thought impassable. Thick jungle, pestilential swamps. Each time they struck, a new town fell. And with each town, his small force grew more towards becoming an army. At the end of those 15 days, he had liberated 500 kilometers of vital riverway and changed the course of the Granadan fight for independence. But his conquests had taken him right to the border of Venezuela, and his mind again began to turn to liberating his homeland. After a couple more brilliant victories and the final assurance of liberty for Granada, he began to march towards his suffering nation. For in Venezuela, the reprisals of the Spanish had been swift and brutal. Bolivar may have had the connections to escape, but most weren't so lucky. Mass executions, rapine, and plunder were rampant. Not even children were spared. But most of the Grenadans didn't want to fight to liberate another country, so with only 500 ill, undersupplied, and undertrained troops, Bolivar crossed once again into his homeland. Through guile, surprise, and fear, he rapidly won another string of victories, swelling his ranks once again. But Bolivar's earlier losses had changed him. He was a sterner man, a grimmer man, and he would meet the Spanish atrocity for atrocity. Soon after entering Venezuela, he declared, "Our vengeance shall rival Spanish ferocity. Our goodwill is at last exhausted, and, since our oppressors compel us to mortal warfare, they shall disappear from America, and our land shall be purged of the monsters that infest it. Our hate shall be inexorable, and our war shall be to the death." And he declared a death sentence for all Spaniards who did not turn against Spain. It galvanized the revolutionaries and drove Republicans to his cause, but it also laid the groundwork for a legacy of blood. Still, his lightning campaign dashed Spanish resistance at Merida, Trujillo, Barquisimeto, and Valencia, and soon, less than a year after he had slipped off in disgrace, he was returning to Caracas, a conquering hero. He was celebrated in the streets. He had liberated Venezuela. But the work was not yet done. The Spanish still had a holdout 100 miles away. Slave uprisings had broken out against the white-led rebellion, and, as would prove worst of all, the Legion of Hell had declared for the Spanish cause. And their name barely does them justice. They were the brutal horsemen of the plains, owing no loyalty to anyone, living in the saddle like Mongols, and holding life, both their own and those they faced, cheap. They were a nightmare that stalked Venezuela. Armed with fire-hardened spears rather than any modern weaponry, they would show up at a town.
You know, it's kind of like the 80s, man. You had those guerrillas in the mountains reaping havoc with governments and stuff like that. They were feared by everyone. So it's same thing. Using the same tactics from years ago, like this year. You know, you have this group here doing the same thing, and you could call it guerrilla warfare because they're using the weapons that they have and attacking and putting fear into people. It's crazy how we are, huh?
Spears rather than any modern weaponry, they would show up at a town, run down the men as they fled, rape the women, and play cruel games where they would impale the children on their lances, leaving the infants there as a gruesome totem for when they rode into battle. And they neither gave nor expected quarter. When they would fight the Republican troops, they would throw themselves at them in mounted waves, overwhelming their firearms with sheer mass and ferocity. And when they won, not a man was spared. And so now, Bolivar's proclamation that this would be a war to the death had truly come to be. But instead of it being a war to the death with the Spanish, it was a war to the death with his own people, becoming a civil war spilling out on racial lines. Because his troops too slaughtered their prisoners, and murdered any of the Legion of Hell that would fall into their hands, often dismembering them and leaving pieces on spikes for all to see.
Wow.
Amidst of all this, any pretense to republicanism disappeared, as Bolivar centralized all power in himself. Meanwhile, atrocities continued to mount. Spaniards wore the ears of the dead as trophies. The Legion left whole villages with nothing but ghosts. And he himself ordered 1,000 prisoners, not even POWs, decapitated one by one. And with each passing day, his hold was slipping. Every victory in the field was offset by the fact that the Legion and the slave uprisings could recruit men far faster than he could, as the vast mixed race and black population saw an opportunity to attack those who had oppressed them. The economy was in tatters and couldn't supply his army or even build new guns, and every victory came at a cost in irreplaceable men. Soon he was putting 12-year-olds under arms.
Wow.
Venezuela was awash in blood, and attrition and time took their toll. On June 15, 1814, waves of horsemen crashed through Republican lines at La Puerta, a critical pass. A month later, they were in Caracas. Panic filled the streets. People fled, run down by horsemen as they tried to get away. Bolivar escaped and rallied his troops to one more time put up a desperate last stand. But by now, the forces he'd been using to bottle up the Spanish had been siphoned off, and the Spanish royalists' forces had been able to recoalesce. In the final battle, heavily outnumbered, Bolivar's Republicans sold themselves dearly, but it would not be enough. And so the Second Republic collapsed. Not from the might of the Spanish, but from the weight of its own internal divisions.
Yeah.
And for the second time, Bolivar found himself on a boat, sailing to New Granada, looking back at a republic that might have been.
Wow, this is, you see, I know a little bit about it, but man, I didn't know this. They were vicious. The things we do. Of course, you have to take into consideration everything that came before that to create the mindset to do such things. And that is why we have to stop things before they get to that point. You know, especially now where we are relatively peaceful in a lot of parts of the world. What the peaceful stuff is, sit down and have a conversation, man. People just want to yell and scream and argue and, you know, we want to yell and scream and argue. You know what I mean? And I did fall for that arguing stuff for a bit there. You know, and I don't do that anymore because it doesn't get anywhere. Because the person that you're arguing with is not going to change their mind. Unless you put a little bit of logical thinking in it. And it's not proving anybody wrong. Because I could possibly learn from them too. If they think like humans. We all could learn from each other. Before it gets to this impaling and putting the heads there and, you know, all that crazy stuff. Humans weren't really meant to do that. They do that when they are pushed into a corner. Or they've been slaughtered and raped and pillaged and all of that. And people say they do it for the Republic and they do it for that. But after a while, it becomes for vengeance more than anything else. And then how are they going to stop after they win? They don't go after the next one and the next one and the next one, because you don't fight for vengeance and then just stop. You know, you're going to keep going. But, you know, I ain't going to babble on here and ting and ting. Listen, man, we got to start taking care of each other. Okay? Cool runnings.